Hello world, thank you for joining us for part 2 of our pyramid series. I know this is a little bit different than what we had in our first video and in the future videos for a background, but it's just important that you understand this very basic concept of how water works before we continue on with our theory, because it's basically the crux of our theory. It's what holds our theory together, and it's very important that you understand it. So what we have here is a hose. I'm holding one end of the hose. It's traveling over here down the side of our garage, over there, up the hill, over to my father. And what we did is we filled the hose with water. So water in my end is sitting to right about here where my fingers are. Maybe a little, it's not a clear hose, I can't tell, but right about here. And it's sitting right about where the bottom of that board is that says water in front of my father. And that's where it's balanced out. The natural elevation of water is balanced out right there. So what we're gonna do is, just to show you, I'm gonna lower my end of the hose, and water's starting to come out. I'm gonna raise it back up. Okay, and then it takes a minute because it needs to balance out, and it's a long hose. But so what we're gonna do is, my dad has a pitcher over there, and he's gonna pour water into his end from the pitcher, and we're gonna show you how it's gonna raise in both ends. It's gonna balance out, slowly rise over here at the same time as over there until it reaches this elevation right here, in which case it's gonna stop raising up the hose over there, and water's gonna start pouring out of the hose on my end instead, and it's going to stay at the same elevation. All right, so he's pouring water into the hose right now. It's going to take a second. It's got to travel through the hose, and now you'll see water's coming out of the hose. All right, so he's still pouring water. We're good. And now he's stopped pouring water. So now after all the water finishes moving, it's going to stop moving. It's going to stop pouring out right here. Now water's still going to bob up and down just a few times just to finally balance out. But water stopped flowing out of my end of the hose, and it's balanced out with the end over there. So now we know the elevation of the water that he has over there is right here. And that is crucial to know. And this concept would work whether you're 200 feet apart like my dad and I, or 200 miles. It doesn't matter how far apart you are. The concept is the same. As long as you can encapsulate water in a pipeline, in a hose, in something, you can move it up and down, as long as this end never reaches the same height as over there. As long as it stays below that elevation, water is going to flow the same. Hello world, thank you for watching video 2 of our pyramid series. Now we need to set the scene up before we continue into this series, so you understand the motivation for building everything we're going to be describing. The Nile actually flowed in 3 seasons in ancient Egypt. The Peret season between November and February is the most normal season of the Nile. Water would flow down the river's natural banks. Then the Shamu season would begin from March to June. This is sometimes referred to as a drought season because the least amount of water would flow during these months. And finally, between July and October, the Nile would begin its flood season, Aket. At this time, the amount of water flowing down the river would increase so much that the water would overrun its natural banks. And they were known for taking advantage of the 3 seasons for farming, planting new crops every year after the Aket season ended, because they would wash new soil down to the land. But what our theory is about to show you is that they were able to figure out how to take advantage of the Aket season in a much larger way.
Something important for you to understand is what food they consumed in ancient Egypt. They were known for consuming a lot of vegetables, obviously, but also birds, eggs, and fish. Our theory focuses on the fish, and you'll see why very shortly. Imagine trying to fish in a moving river, especially the Nile that fluctuated so drastically every year. There wouldn't be many fish. The way they would have collected their fish is by walking upriver 50 miles to the lake Morris and fishing in its waters. This would have been a long and strenuous process. It wasn't until 6,000 to 9,000 years ago that somebody developed a plan that would remove the need to walk up to Lake Morris permanently. Before you can comprehend his plan, you need to understand the lake's elevation.
Its elevation at some point in the past, roughly 15 to 20,000 years ago, was at 120 feet above sea level. Shortly after that, its connection with the Nile was cut off, and Lake Morris's only source of water is the Nile. So when this happened, its elevation lowered to 15 feet below sea level. After this happened, sometime between 6,000 and 9,000 years ago, like my dad just said, somebody reopened its connection with the Nile. We're going to accredit this to King Morris based on Herodotus' writings, but that isn't important. What is important
is that when this was done, the elevation of the lake rose again to 82 feet above sea level. And this is where we have it sitting at now, at 82 feet above sea level. If you're wondering where we found these numbers, please click on the link in the description below, and it'll take you to a paper written by 2 archaeologists that actually studied the Fayum region. And this is where we found our elevations.
Now that you know the lake's elevation, we can finally get to his plan. Simultaneously, Morris dredging the connection between Lake Morris and the Nile, he would have begun carving a tunnel into the limestone near Lake Morris underground all the way to the Giza Plateau. When this was complete, he could look down the hole in the Giza Plateau and find out the elevation of the water in Lake Morris. If you don't quite understand how, please go back and watch our hose video. We try to describe this demonstration, this concept, in a simple and possibly easy way for you to understand. After they determined Morris's elevation, he instructed his men to carve a sphinx around the hole extending from the ground where they were standing, all the way down several feet below the water line. He ensured the hole would be at the top of the sphinx head, possibly for cosmetic reasons or possibly to be able to climb down and find the water's elevation at a later date if they needed to. After the sphinx was carved, he had 2 tunnels carved into its body down the pipeline coming from Morris, one by its arm and the other by its tail.
It's important that you understand the sphinx we have drawn here is actually scaled down in perfect proportions with our scale of 1 inch per 10 feet. So if you were to measure this drawing, you would see that we are speculating the sphinx was 230 feet long and 120 feet tall. This is not the sphinx you see today in Giza, and we'll get into that in a future video, so please don't argue with the dimensions before you finish our series. Now, what carving the holes in the sphinx accomplished is water would be able to flow through the pipeline from Morris out of these holes. When this happened, the water would suck all the fish near it into the pipeline as well. So they essentially just transferred all the fish from the lake near the hole to the Giza Plateau. This would be an amazing source of food. However, it only would have worked during the Akhet season when the Nile was flooding and the elevation of the lake had risen above the height of these holes. After the Nile stopped flooding, the lake would continue to drain until its elevation lowered and water couldn't flow out of the holes anymore.
What we believe they did to maximize the time they could use this system is place doors on the holes at the bottom of the Sphinx. They could open and close the doors. These doors based on the demand for fish. When the doors were closed, water would balance out in Lake Morris and stop flowing, extending the amount of time each year they could utilize the system.
This system worked and was used for thousands of years. They would have just dealt with these problems during this time. But a much worse problem would have begun to develop over this time. The connection between Lake Morris and the Nile River would have slowly begun to fill back in with dirt and debris, cutting it off again from the Nile. Each year, less and less water would have entered the lake, and they probably noticed a loss in pressure through the system over the years. So at 3150 BC, King Narmar developed a plan to solve not only the issue of raising the lake's elevation, but also the problem of only benefiting from it for 4 months of every year. He made a truce with the king of Upper Egypt and began digging a tunnel all the way from Aswan to the Giza Plateau.
The reason we know King Morris did this is he is the king credited with combining Upper and Lower Egypt. If you're unfamiliar with ancient Egypt, we'll go over it very briefly. Up until this point in history, Egypt was separated into 2 separate kingdoms, Upper and Lower Egypt. Lower Egypt was rich because of the delta, and Upper Egypt was jealous and attempted to conquer Lower Egypt many times unsuccessfully. At 31 BC, King Narmar unified the 2 lands, but Egyptologists still don't know completely why this happened. They can only speculate that Lower Egypt lost a battle and was taken over. This speculation, however, doesn't make sense because neither Upper or Lower Egypt had to change their customs or beliefs after they combined, like what would have happened if one lost a war and was conquered.
Thank you for watching this video. Join us for our next video where we continue revealing King Narmar's plan and reveal for the first time in history the devastating effects of air encountered in a water main system.
Thank you.